This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 222, number 221B Baker Street, Part 2. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And we're back this week to bring you Part 2 of a reading that we started last week, number 221B Baker Street by Vincent Sterrett. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get into that. The show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles221b. Be careful there, it's not 222. We're giving deference to this particular episode since it is a special one. So it's ihose.co/trifles221b. There you can find the show notes to this episode. Anything else that comes to mind, you can certainly follow us on social media. We are I Hear of Sherlock in all of those places. And if you'd like to email us, we are trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. We do appreciate the support that we're seeing from our fans. Every little bit counts, and we want you to know that we see what you're doing. So thank you. For as little as $1 a month, it all helps. Now, let's get back to where we were. In the early paragraphs of the Musgrave Ritual, we have perhaps our most illuminating description of the room's untidiness. That it was not always so, later expressions would seem to indicate. It may be that Holmes, as time went on, improved. But our chambers, Watson said, quote, were always full of chemicals and of criminal relics, which had a way of wandering into unlikely positions and of turning up in the butter dish or even less desirable places, end quote. It was his friend's papers, however, that principally distressed the doctor. They were all over the place. Quote, he had a horror of destroying documents, especially those which were connected with his past cases, and yet it was only once in every year or so that he would muster energy to docket and arrange them. Thus, month after month, his papers accumulated until every corner of the room was stacked with bundles of manuscript which were so on no account to be burned, and which could not be put away save by their owner. End quote. There can be little doubt that Watson was a very patient man. One suspects there were protests now and then that may have been omitted from the record. No doubt he rushed into the street when, as occasionally happened, the room became too malodorously a laboratory. The detective's chemical investigations went forward. It would appear at a side table. Pictures of this side include activity occur from time to time, and one is afforded by the opening pages of the naval treaty that is memorable. Quote, a large curved retort was boiling furiously in the bluish flame of a Bunsen burner, and the distilled drops were condensing into a 2-liter measure. He dipped into this bottle or that, drawing out a few drops of each with his glass pipette, and finally brought a test tube containing a solution over to the table. In his right hand, he had a slip of litmus paper, end quote.
It is another of those unforgettable vignettes of the detective and the doctor in their rooms in Baker Street. If the paper remained blue, then all was well. If it turned red, it meant the life of a man. Holmes dipped the paper into the test tube, and it flushed at once into a dull and dirty crimson. "I shall be at your service in 1 instant, Watson," said Sherlock Holmes, looking up from his labors. "You will find the tobacco in the Persian slipper." Oh, memorable and thrilling moment that still contrives to stir the happy reader, even upon a 31st perusal. It's one of the landmarks, by the way, that Persian slipper. One fancies that it hung upon the wall and not too far from Holmes' armchair near the fireplace. Opposite the detective's chair would be the doctor's, an armchair also, we are told, and it is likely that they seldom interchanged. Holmes was low and worn, and obviously it was broad enough to contain the coiled length of the detective in his moments of profoundest concentration. The other chairs were scattered anywhere, one thinks, and 3 at least are indicated. A wooden chair, a cane-backed chair occasionally occupied by Watson, and another armchair, presumably for guests. There was also a settee and just possibly a pair of sofas, or it may be that when Watson spoke of sofas, he was thinking of a sofa and a settee. Certainly, there was a lamp, in addition to the conventional gas fixtures of the period, and this would stand upon the principal table beside the breakfast bell. And between the table and the hearth there stretched the bearskin rug. Who has forgotten the extraordinary entrance of Dr. Thornycroft Huxtable, M.A., Ph.D., etc., whose first action when the door had closed was to stagger against the table and then collapse upon the hearthrug.
In a corner, when it was not in use, stood the acid-stained deal-top chemical table with its accompanying stool. There was also a bench, one wonders, or was it a bench and table according to the moment's whim? In another corner leaned the violin case, and somewhere stood a pipe rack filled with pipes. The spirit case and gasogene, one thinks, were in the corner with the violin, and probably upon a shelf. One of the shelves, no doubt, that held the detective's books. Precisely where to set the desks down, though, is a puzzle. There were 2 of them, one Holmes's and one Watson's, and what with a safe still waiting to be placed, the room begins to seem a bit congested. Conceivably, the safe was in the detective's bedroom. The mantel, one gathers, was a mess. The clock stood there, and of all Holmes's unanswered correspondence, as we have seen, was transfixed in its center by the detective's knife. But that it held still other cluttering matters is easily imaginable. For example, loose tobacco. Watson's clear upon the point. Calling upon his friend in the early pages of the case of Mr. Victor Hatherley, he found the fathomer smoking his early breakfast pipe while waiting for his breakfast, a, quote, before breakfast pipe, end quote, the doctor tells us, quote, which was composed of all the plugs and dottles left behind from his smokes of the day before, all carefully dried and collected on the corner of the mantelpiece, end quote. And certainly there would also be books and pipes and glasses. On the walls, one visualizes the scientific charts and such pictures as the collaborators found alluring. A queer conglomeration. 2 of Watson's are of record, a portrait of General Gordon, framed, and an unframed portrait of the American Beecher. That the latter ultimately acquired a frame and found its place upon the wall seems more than likely in view of Watson's thought of it. For a time, however, it merely stood on the top of the doctor's books, a circumstance which permits us to deduce that the friends made shift to keep their books apart. And the books, no doubt, were in their shelves against the wall. The doctor's taste in literature was not exactly notable, but we may assume a medical collection of some merit, with here and there perhaps one of Clark Russell's fine sea stories, and a yellow-backed novel of sensational and inexpensive sort. The Baker Street Journal continues to be the leading Sherlockian publication since its founding in 1946 by Edgar W. Smith. In its pages, you'll find both serious scholarship and articles that play the game. The journal is essential reading for anyone interested in Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a world where it's always 1895. If you subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, you'll get 4 quarterly issues as well as the Christmas annual. You don't have to be a member of the BSI or of any Sherlockian society for that matter to subscribe to the journal. It's open to anyone who enjoys talking about, reading about, and writing about Sherlock Holmes. And you can also contribute to the BSJ. Only your imagination limits. Your imagination is the only limitation there. So get on the bandwagon and subscribe to the Baker Street Journal this year. Make it an important part of your commitment to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe today.
The library of Sherlock Holmes, if one may call it that, was personal and proprietary, but decidedly eclectic. It would be a pleasant task to catalog it for the record, but that one would be justified in placing upon the shelves each writer ever quoted by the detective is subject for debate. Of Holmes' reading, we are given many glimpses in the long series of his adventures. It is a very respectable list of authors, and this in spite of Watson's early libel that his companion's knowledge of literature and philosophy was nil. A man who is able to compare Hafiz with Horace and to quote Tacitus and Thoreau, Jean-Paul, Flaubert, and Goethe aptly and without hesitation is not a man who may be lightly called unread. Carlyle and Meredith, too, figure in the detective's reading. They may even have been upon his shelves, and we may be rather sure of Winwood Reade. One suspects a Bible somewhere on the premises, but we may be entirely certain only of the reference works. They were there, unquestionably, in number, from the current Whitaker to the red line of Baedeker's, and biographical encyclopedias without end. Foremost, however, on the shelves in any list must always stand that row of formidable scrapbooks, the detective's own, which so many of his fellow citizens would have been happy to destroy. For many years, says Watson, he had adopted a system of docketing all paragraphs concerning men and things, so it was difficult to name a subject or a person on which he could not at once furnish information. One sees them stretched across a section of the room, all neatly lettered on their buckram backs in the precise and clerky hand of Sherlock Holmes. Somehow, one doubts that Holmes or Watson ran to book plates.
We're going to pause for a quick word from our sponsor, and we will be back with the conclusion of number 221B, Baker Street. Thus, then, one sees the rooms in Baker Street, and somewhere on the premises, a dressing gown. Within the dressing gown is Sherlock Holmes. One does not hold with Father Knox that Watson in this connection was inconsistent, because the famous gown, early described as blue, was later called by other shades and colors to the bewilderment of careful readers. It is nowhere explicitly asserted, Reverend Sir, that Mr. Sherlock Holmes possessed a single robe, and that of stated hue. To the contrary, the constant inference is that there were several. That the doctor has shown us his friend and hero in robes of different colors is evidence, if anything, of accuracy. In a London practice covering more than a score of years, a dozen dressing gowns may well be indicated. And Watson, too, is there within the room, as much a fixture as the detective himself. That solid English figure, a, quote, middle-sized, strongly built man, square jaw, thick neck, mustache, end quote, must be forever the second figure in the immemorial tableau. A man with qualities of heart and mind that command our love, even when we laugh most loudly at his stupidities. His independent virtues are not clamorous, but Of the two collaborators, he would be the least trying upon a desert island. It is through the eyes of this dull, good fellow that we behold the greater figure of his more celebrated companion. It is his devotion to his friend that is, in a large degree, responsible for ours.
And Mrs. Hudson? She, too, is on the scene whenever she is needed and sometimes when she is not. Once, alas, she was called Mrs. Turner. It was during that preliminary excitement of the case of Irene Adler when Watson's marriage had kept the friends apart, but it is inconceivable that the doctor should have forgotten her name. His mind, no doubt, was on some other matter at the moment as he set down the record of that curious episode. A patient whose name was Turner was, no doubt, awaiting his attention. Mrs. Hudson, landlady at 221B Baker Street, is Mrs. Hudson and nobody else in the world. Thus they lived, and thus they live, and the old building is there, says Dr. Briggs, to prove it. Sherlock Holmes and Baker Street. It was no idle anecdote, that story of the charabanc of schoolboys. And who is Sherlock Holmes? The spirit of a town and of a time. He is the fog, says William Bolitho. In that crying old street, Baker Street, the glow of sea coal in the grates, where the English servant brings in to you tea and muffins and snug napkins of odorous toast. He is the mystery of the house opposite, of the grubby little shop around the corner you noticed and wondered about, of the old lady, half perceived in her shining broom, who passes through empty Eaton Square every Wednesday afternoon. Sherlock is he who answers when you ask the air, who lives there, I wonder? What is the story behind that drawn blind in London? From him you may expect something much too subtle to be advertised. Cabs, slurring through the mud, sounds and sights and presences of the old 90s in Baker Street, that time and that place, which above all thought itself final, and that nothing different was ever going to happen again.
Bravo, Mr. Sterrett. Bravo. Honored to share that in this particular episode. And Bert, I think to bring us home, it is no more appropriate than to have a reading of a poem by Carolyn Wells, which first appeared in Collier's in 1908 and eventually made a reappearance in Edgar Smith's Profile by Gaslight in 1944. Why don't you take it away?
Thank you. Well, I was just delighted by this poem. Carolyn Wells was an author, a mystery author, very successful, who wrote a series of pastiches and parodies about an imaginary group. She made fun of the other great detectives of the era, including Sherlock Holmes. And then, as you say, she published this lovely poem in Collier's 5 years after the return of Sherlock Holmes ran in Collier's magazine in the States. I followed many a devious way. I've traveled fast and traveled far, beyond the night, across the day, by many a mountain, lake, and scar, 'neath ilex, palm, and deodar, I viewed the homes of fame's elite. Why does frowning fortune bar those hallowed rooms in Baker Street? There's Carlyle's house you have to pay, houses of Shakespeare, Poe, Lagar. There's Landor's at Fiesole, and someone's villa at Dinard. Nero's and Borgia's houses jar. Though Baedeker's their charms repeat, they should note with a double star those hallowed rooms in Baker Street. My eager quest I would not stay for jeweled house of Al-Nashar, Diogenes' quaint tub of gray, historic bow of old Omar, Peterhof of the Russian Tsar. These were to me no special treat. Could I but reach by cab or car those hallowed rooms in Baker Street. Oh, Sherlock, my fondest wishes are that on a day I yet may greet, haply in some far avatar, those hallowed rooms in Baker Street.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Here dwell together still two men of note, who never lived and so can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote that age before the world went all awry. But still the game's afoot for those with ears attuned to catch the distant view. Hallo! England is England yet for all our fears. Only those things the heart believes are true. A yellow fog swirls past the window pane as night descends upon this fabled street. A lonely hansom splashes through the rain. The ghostly gas lamps fail at 20 feet. Here, though the world explode, these two survive. And it is always 1895.